And it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. In just a minute, we have Alejandro Rojas coming up with the UFO Updates. Our guest this evening is Paul Stonehill, and we're going to be talking about USOs in Russia. I'm pretty excited about tonight's show. I've been trying to get someone on to talk about that subject for quite a while. It's a fascinating subject. If you are supporting the show, I want to thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Our bandwidth, for some reason, is going crazy lately. That means we're getting a lot of downloads, which is good. So I really do appreciate your support. It really helps out a lot. If you want to listen to the show for free, you can help us out. All you have to do is go to podcastufo.com every Wednesday, 8 to 10 Eastern Standard Time, and listen to the show, the full show, live there. Also, it's on the Dark Matter Digital Network every Thursday from 10 p.m. to midnight Eastern Standard Time. So you can catch the whole show there as well. And that's all I got. How you doing, Alejandro?
I am well. How are you?
Great, great. Things are going good. We've had a beautiful summer here in the East Coast. Mm-hmm. It's been totally dry, no mosquitoes, which is really rare for Maine. No mosquitoes, no ticks. It's really nice.
We're in haboobi season.
Haboobi? What? What is that?
Haboob. They're actually called haboobs, where, these big waves of sand come, like on the movies.
Really?
Where you have these huge clouds. Now, unlike the movies, it's not like they shred your skin or they're that scary. It's really just this dust that comes over. And it feels like when they come up through, it feels like you're in in a vacuum or something like a vacuum machine it's just dusty, and it's this light cloud of dust. It's yucky. Visibility can be a little lower. And it's just kind of gross. But what's interesting is there's lightning in these things, and the lightning goes sideways and everything, and that can be really weird. But it looks really cool. You can go to the Phoenix News and stuff. I call them haboobies because that's just more fun, but they're actually called haboobs.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I bet the kids love playing with that name. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, my girlfriend's daughter, she's a teenager, just be a senior this year. She doesn't like that word. She doesn't like it when I say that.
Oh, well, yeah, that could be.
Which, of course, just makes me want to say it more.
Right. Yeah, I was wondering when you first started talking about that, if there was any static electricity, does it make everything like real staticky as well?
No, not really. Sometimes rain comes with it, and it's just real dirty. It's a dirt rain.
Wow.
But, yeah, and it makes your cars dirty, which is funny out here because there's so little rain and so much sunshine that you don't have to wash your car much, and they stay so clean. Being from Colorado, that was one thing I noticed because it's hard to keep your car clean in Colorado in the winter especially. But everybody's car is usually so clean out here until a haboobi comes by.
Yeah. It must be low UFO sightings during haboobi season.
Yeah, which, of course, you know what? That would be an interesting statistic. I wouldn't doubt if there were less. However, Arizona, just because of the clear skies, I think, has quite a few sightings all year round.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. So what is happening out there?
What is happening? This is exciting for you because I know you're a big fan. This is a story about Rowan Blanchard.
Rowan Blanchard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Do you know who that is?
I don't have any idea.
I didn't know actually either until I read the story, and some of the younger listeners, of which you probably have none, may know. I guess she's a Disney Channel star. She's on this show called Girl Meets World. But there's a story about her. Why I bring her up in particular is kind of because I'm feeling kind of snarky, and I want to kind of rub this into people. There's a story by MTV saying that she accidentally photographed a UFO. And she posted this picture to Instagram saying, "Oh, is this a UFO in my picture?" It's not. What it is it's a reflection from the highway lights. You can see the other highway lights in the picture. The reason why I like to talk about this is that it's so funny. This happened, you may remember, maybe a year or so ago. In Texas, someone took a picture like this. It went into the news, and people went crazy about it. A lot of us, said, no, that's not what it is. It's a reflection on the windshield from the highway lights. And it was shocking to me how many people got upset by me and others. Even when I said this on your show, people got upset. People got really upset. So we have similar lights here on our highway. So I took my phone and I recorded those lights out my windshield, and sure enough, the same effect happens. You see the round lights. Like the lights themselves are so bright that the camera can't pick up the shape that they're in. You just see this big, massive, bright light. But in the reflection, you actually see the individual lights in a circle. So they look like a circle of light. So that's essentially what's happening. So I recorded this, and I put it on our YouTube. So if you go to YouTube, and you can see this effect. But unfortunately, young Miss Blanchard, it's not a UFO. It is just a reflection. But I just want to remind people of that phenomenon.
Wow. So when someone like her posts something like that, I bet it just absolutely goes crazy.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. There'll be lots of people saying it's a UFO. Who knows? So, yeah. But there you go. Wow. What can you do?
I mean, what can you do? What can you do? Yeah.
Nothing.
Well,
you can't do a damn thing, Martin.
Speaking of celebrities and UFOs, there was some progress Tom DeLonge was going to supposedly make. Are you aware of any updates on that?
Not really. I mean, he said he was going to release a fiction book about what he was told by different military witnesses, his deep throats. And he did release this book. It's a fiction book, and I don't think I haven't heard that it's done very well, nor has anyone really made a big deal out of it. I've read from at least a couple of people who read through it, and you just can't make heads or tail of what the heck he's trying to reveal. That's so shocking. So,
wow.
No, the book. I was thinking once the book came out, perhaps there would be a big, ado. At least finally, we would hear what he was claiming, that he had information he had received, but not much. So it's been silent that way.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Because the thing that celebrities have is, that when they have a huge fan base, they have a lot of power. And, I hate to see anything abused or misused when it comes to things like this. But, that sounds like the person you were speaking of from Disney there, and I already forgot her name, Blanchard or something like that. Sounds like that was just a mistake.
Yeah, other celebrities have done the same thing. Who was it? Russell Crowe,
right?
Did the same thing, and yeah. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, he was really sticking to it to UFO even after it was debunked. But I don't know that he was aware of the debunking or what people figured it out to be. I think they did a great job figuring it out and demonstrating that they were right. But yeah, it happens. And then sometimes celebrities have some sightings that are more unexplainable. Mm-hmm. But I think it's interesting. I think it's great that Tom DeLonge's interested in the topic.
Yeah.
And it often happens. It even happened with me where I was really excited by certain cases. But then when I had the time to actually really do deep, thorough research into these cases, I found that they weren't as exciting as I thought they were, or that people were purporting them to be. And that could be a stage that he's going through. It's really hard to do all the research. And with everything that he does, I'm sure he's only got limited time to do this sort of looking anyway. So, yeah.
Right.
So I wish him all the luck, and we'll see what happens when he releases more information, hoping that he will.
Yeah, right. So what else is happening out there?
What else is happening? There's been a couple other interesting sightings. There is a Utah witness who saw, and this is, I've seen a few of these. He was in the town of West Jordan, and he saw lights hovering that he felt were under 500 feet. He said at first he thought the lights were a plane, but they weren't moving, just staying still, really still. And when he got closer, the two lights, he saw that the two lights were connected by a cylinder. So it's just another interesting sighting. There's a drawing of it. I always kind of wonder if perhaps these cylinders that they see are just planes, with lights on each of their wings, but it's hard to say. He said that, on each side was a dome where these lights were that he felt were probably the size of trampolines. So, I don't know.
Huh. No noise?
Yeah.
Or did it report anything about, was there any report about any noise?
Don't think they did report anything about a noise.
The first thing it makes me think of is a helicopter for some reason. You're saying these trampoline type of things.
Was it like a psychic premonition?
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the other news is, well, a couple of things. If you wouldn't mind me talking about, I don't think I did talk about, because I only posted this on the 19th, my astronomers and UFOs story.
Yeah. That's a great, I want you to talk about that. That's really good.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So I did post a story. I originally wrote this for the magazine, the last issue of our Open Minds magazine. However, that magazine is no longer in print, and we're out of copies, so you can't get it anywhere. So I'm starting to post the stories from the magazine onto our website. And one of them I'm really happy about, and that I did work for a long time researching, is one about astronomers and UFOs. And one of the reasons I really wanted to write this article is because I had talked with Seth Shostak. He is the lead scientist for SETI. And when I was interviewing him, he said, if there really was something to UFOs, astronomers would be all over this. But they're not, because astronomers are looking at the night sky all of the time. And I asked him in particular about one book that was written by an astronomer, and he hadn't read it. So I was kind of disappointed in him that, he would make such a statement without having researched that, which is he's inaccurate. Not only do I demonstrate in this that astronomers are interested, they have had sightings, but that astronomers are really the main ones to have pushed forward the research into UFOs. First one being J. Allen Hynek, who was a consultant for the Air Force, and he was a famous astronomer. I've got a actually show coming up. We're going to do this thing called UFO Magazine, but it's going to be online on YouTube that we're going to post for free, where I'm going to cover the 1952 case in Washington, which was a really big deal. We're going to cover it in depth.
Great.
But when that event happened, it spawned an article from Life magazine about UFOs in 1952. And in that article, they talked about sightings from other very prominent astronomers. So I talk about that. That then prompted Hynek to do a report and an investigation on astronomers and UFOs, where he found astronomers were reporting UFOs, and a lot of them did have some positive things to say about the research into UFOs. And then later on, Peter Sturrock wrote this book, UFO Enigma, and he talks about an investigation he did with another astronomical society where he interviewed them about UFOs and found similar findings to Hynek's. But this is just somewhat of a demonstration. More recently, there's an astronomer in New York, Derek Pitts, who actually had a lot of positive things to say about Leslie Kean's book and talking about how, that's made him think that UFOs really are something that we should look into. Michio Kaku, who's a physicist, but theoretical physicist, has always said the same. So I put all this together, and I think it's really important, and I would love for people to read it because if you ever get that, are astronomers interested, take a look at this article and you could say, yeah, they are, buddy.
That's right.
Mr. Shostak. And then, tell Shostak, yeah, they sure are, and then give him a noogie.
Yeah. And then send him a link to your story.
Yeah.
All at the same time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, I've got that is great. I appreciate it. I really do encourage the listeners to go to openminds.tv. You'll also see a link on the show notes how to get there, and check that article out. I was fascinated by it. It was really great. Oh, by the way, this weekend there is the Experiencers Speak coming up here in Portland, Maine, with Audrey Hewins puts that on every year.
Well, and the MUFON Symposium's this weekend. I'll be leaving in the morning, so
that's right,
I'll
down
be
in Florida,
there, and that'll be fun. Yep,
and Ben Moss will be there. Tony Angiola. Keep going with the names of someone we just had on the show.
Rich Hoffman,
that's
I think
it.
you had
Rich
on
Hoffman.
the show recently.
Yep.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Robert Powell, Richard Thiem, Erling Strand, Paola Harris, I think it's, she's speaking, John Greenwald, so yeah.
Isn't it Richard Teamy? That's how you're supposed to say that name.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm guessing.
Yep.
And I'm screwing it up, I guess.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, you have a good one.
Okay, you too.
All right, now talk to you next week. All right, hang in, everyone, for this quick music break. We'll be right back with Paul Stonehill, and we're talking USOs in Russia. All right, we're on with Paul Stonehill. Zdravstvuyte, Paul.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. And I wanted to start by saying that Alejandro is absolutely right about the astronomers. And in my books, I list Soviet astronomers that definitely were interested in UFOs and USOs, but of course UFOs primarily. And some of them were not afraid to speak. There were different periods in Soviet history when you could speak a lot or you couldn't speak at all, but I do list those astronomers. So he's absolutely right.
Yes, I do remember. I also interviewed Chef Shostak, and he did make the same comment on my show as well. And I remember right after that, I was contacted by an astronomer in the UK, and he said, what Shostak just said is not true because I'm an astronomer, and I just watched a big black triangle fly over me. So, and this has been happening. Yes, they're out there in the night sky a lot of times for many, many hours. I've joined them a few times, and just plain looking up at the sky, it's bound to happen. And for someone to be closed-minded like that and say it never happens is too bad. He's right. He's inaccurate. So let's talk about you, Paul. You have quite an interesting background, and the listener can see that in our show notes. You grew up in the Soviet Union at the time, in Kiev or that area, and and then you eventually made it over to the U.S. But how early in your life did the interests in UFOs begin for you, and why?
I would say very early, probably when I was 8, and I met somebody who had actually witnessed a UFO over the Arctic. And besides that, I was also interested in reading a very famous and very fearless Soviet magazine called Technika Молодежи, where they published interesting articles that touched upon ufology ancient visitations, ancient aliens, and so forth.
Wow. Okay. And you have I wasn't aware of this until I was reading through your biography, but you've written other books with Philip Mantle. Philip's been on the show a number of times, and but I am really, really interested in the unidentified submersible objects because there has been some great stories about that. So I would love for you to just jump right into the topic and what you discovered while you were writing this book. And by the way, the title of the book, and it can be found on Amazon, and also it's on Richard Dolan Press, is Russia's USO Secrets, and again with co-author Philip Mantle. So,
yes, and if anybody wants to find out more about our books and also my Chinese UFO research and others, it's www.Paul Stonehill Russian UFO and USOresearch.com. Very easy. Everything is there. What I wanted to let you know is that my primary interest was the way the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union, and to the extent possible, modern states in the former Soviet Union territory, how they studied UFOs and most interesting cases. And that's what the book will have. I list cases. I think I have about 20, myself and Philip collected information for about, about 20 chapters, and we break it down into different regions and different areas. For example, the Arctic Ocean sightings, very interesting, or the Baltics. And we try to go as back to the antiquity as possible, because there is a lot to show, and through the modern times, but especially the Soviet period, because it was a fascinating period in our history when it was the mightiest country in the world in terms of territory, and they assumed the world, the military power. They experimented a lot. They've done a lot of damage to the land of Russia and other lands through the experiments, but at the same time, they had the power to harness UFO observations like no one else ever did. In 1978, actually a little bit earlier, special instructions went to all the branches of the Soviet armed forces to study, they called it anomalous aerial phenomena, UFOs. You should not be saying UFOs. It was a bourgeois invention, but and it was a very, very powerful program, because information streamed into the Soviet centers. There were 2 research centers, and we'll list them in the book, and quite a lot was collected. Besides that, we had independent researchers who dared to study UFOs, and people like Felix Ziegel and a few others achieved quite a lot, William Bachov, a few more, and collected information. And for example, we have somebody, there was Alexander Kuzovkin, a very, very diligent researcher who collected fascinating information about a USO he cited. He was told by scientists who had seen it at under the water in the Black Sea. It was a gigantic 10-story building, as tall as a 10-story building, standing vertically. What should I say? A wheel-like structure with numerous lights, and they observed it face to face. And then it changed, went into horizontal position and left at incredible speed. And, you had information like this. Plus, like I said, you had the military of all the branches bringing information in. Also, to the extent they were interested, which was not really very much, was the KGB, who had to receive information from the informers. There were too many informers in the Soviet Union, and anything unusual or suspicious they would see, they would run to the KGB and provide information. But the most important, the most interesting source of information were the Soviet armed forces. Of that I am proud, because I had relatives who had served in the Russian and Soviet Navy, it was the Navy that was spearheaded such research because they had to know what was going on. And in the book we list all the details, but what's interesting that it started early in 1960s, and they created special teams of highly professional, highly educated military scientists who would visit Soviet naval bases and venture outside of the Soviet borders too, because they were quite concerned about USOs, the so-called quackery and other phenomena they mentioned, which impacted Soviet spy missions, submarine programs, and also would basically interfere sometimes with the military games that they had conducted.
Wow.
Of course, most worrisome to them was the appearance of UFOs and UFOs in the secret military bases in the Kola Peninsula, for example, which is a very strategically located place and home of the Soviet Navy, North Fleet. Very important, that's where they're stationed, and submarines and special factories that produce the most secret Soviet and Russian submarines. And you had UFOs there all over the place, especially in the years of through 78 to 1980s. But that's just one piece of the Soviet territory. Russia is a gigantic country, and the Soviet Union was even bigger. And no matter where, and we'll list chapters, Chukotka, Kamchatka, you name it, Sea of Okhotsk, others, you had USOs. And, we provide information provided to us that we found through our research from the military observers, the best ones there can be, from people, from scientists, from some government officials, and, of course, from scientists like we mentioned the astronomers and others. And I wanted to say, I just want to put in as much as I can into this conversation, but I wanted to say that what we found out is that USOs had been attracted to the Soviet Union in many ways because of the ecological damage done to the country.
Really?
This was very interesting because through the years, and you could see, based on the reports, a high level of USO and UFO activity, especially in the years, where they had ecological incidents, or like Chernobyl. But of course, it has nothing to do with USOs, but we had, in our books, we list the 1986 UFO over Chernobyl. Very interesting. But, and what we found out that through the history, some of the most interesting years for USO activity were 1965, 1982, especially 1982, 1978, 1979, and a few years after. But I would underline 1965 and 1982 because based on the reports we have in the book, observations by Soviet naval personnel within the Soviet territories and outside. We have a whole chapter about the international sightings. It's more than one chapter, but we kind of wanted to list it that way. You will see cases going back from 1965 around the world and in Russia. And also, there were interesting cases in 1968 and 1978, and cases around South America, for example, where Soviet scientific ships, which definitely contained, intelligence personnel aboard, were they involved in military in the collection of scientific data, and when they lowered their cables with special equipment, down into the to the bottom of the ocean, to say what they got back were cables that were just sheared off, and we found confirmation. We just try not to list the story without trying to find other confirmation. So we went to scientific magazines to find out if such, for example, an expedition actually existed, and we do provide confirmation. Very interesting. So in 1982, I'm going to be jumping around a little bit, but I do want your listeners to understand. 1982 was a significant year. And many people, nowadays they come to me about the story of the so-called swimmers. And this took place in 1982 when a detachment of Soviet frogmen basically perished because they tried to capture very unusual, gigantic humanoid beings at the, I don't want to say the bottom of the Lake Baikal, but below, working on whatever they needed to do without any appearance of the breathing apparatuses or anything else. And there was a very sad command given. Yeah, and we know this was a very interesting story, and we found confirmation years later from a very respected Russian writer who heard about it also in 1986. And we present information as to where we got this 1982 case, but moreover, we get confirmation about the same year, observation of a very identical being in the same, I don't want to say uniform, but dressed the same way, from the annals of the Soviet secret UFO research program called Setka, net in Russian. This was the program, like I said, that started in 1978 and lasted officially through 1991. Although we knew that, we know that some people stayed on through 1996, and we're not sure about what's going on today. But that was the Soviet program, just to research UFOs, their impact on the Soviet armed forces, possibility of catching a UFO, so to say, into the into the Setka, net, and also, to find out how they can be utilized. And this was, I wouldn't want to say magnificence, because they had a lot of difficulties, but this was a program that was divided into two sections. One was the academic side, the other one was the military side. And the military people were always more practical and curious. Now, the academicians were very much like the scientists we mentioned before, those scientists, those astronomers that don't want to believe anything, because it's convenient to do so, not to pay attention to what's going on really around you in the world. And it was very interesting because the military personnel got somewhat upset. I wanted to use another verb, I'll not say it, but they were very much upset. And they actually extended a hand of friendship to independent Russian UFO researchers who were kicked out from the any cooperation with the academical circles, and they wanted to know what was going on. Why is it that our skies, our land, our territories, our seas and oceans are being penetrated by unusual objects without any explanation? Everybody knew this were not, they knew this were not the Americans. They were not stupid. They knew that NATO faced very much the same.
But was there any propaganda saying that it was American at the time? Of
course. Of course. First of all, in early 1950s, and we show it in our books, this was the, I think it began in 1953, if I'm not mistaken, the very first article against UFOs. It was a bourgeois invention, and then they say this is what they want to do to take minds of the working people away from the troubles in the United States and so on. Also, they would translate Menzel's book, the debunking, ufology per se. They published it in the Soviet Union, and they would go out of their way to say that UFOs don't exist, but at the same time, you couldn't hide it. This was the impetus for the UFO research program. In 1977, there were a number of observations that couldn't be explained. Some of them were launches of the Soviet military satellites. That's not even a question. But accompanying those launches were UFOs seen throughout the Baltic and northern Russia. Nobody could explain it. And that's why they had enough, and they got together. It was the Military Industrial Commission of the Soviet Union, responsible to the Politburo, through several levels, bureaucracy. Nevertheless, they were given money, they were given abilities to study UFOs, and they were given permission to go out to all of the armed forces and ask them for reports. I have, and I believe we list in our books, special Soviet forms that every military person had to fill out should he see anything unusual in the sky or in the sea. Very, very interesting.
Wow.
It is history. Mm-hmm. And, this continued for a long time. They changed names of that program from Setka to Galactica because they had to get funding. Every 5 years, they had to get government funding and to show that something was done. We're not sure, no one is, how much they caught. We know enough to make us amazed and fascinated. And we list their findings and some of the reports in the book, this one and others, but especially this one about USOs, because we have reports that we were able to obtain, and Russian ufologists, Ukrainian Russian ufologists, let me put it that way, our colleagues, and some of them very good contacts, some of them very brave people, were able to obtain the Setka reports about USO sightings, and very interesting, and some of them in quite remote places that we want to underline for people to catch their eyes on, let's say. And but to stick to the program, I got to tell you that actually it was the Navy, Soviet Navy, that kicked the ball. They were the ones that issued first instructions to the naval forces, and under Admiral Gorshkov, they had special military teams, researchers, like I said, who would venture throughout, different bases around the world, trying to study the impact of the quackery. That's in our, I believe, chapter 2. And that's a very interesting Ghosts of the Ocean. I think when people read it, I know those who read it are quite fascinated, and we're happy that we were able to bring out this phenomenon to the Western world and to other places, because this was something that existed and bothered the Soviet Union from the mid-1960s to mid-1980s, when the phenomenon just disappeared. For now, we're not sure. If it hasn't come back. And what's interesting in the book, we were showing that Soviets were not the only ones who were interested in this very unusual phenomenon, down under the surface of the ocean, of unusual, gigantic beings. I don't know if you can even describe it like that, chasing Soviet submarines. It was NATO also was interested, but I think the two sides blamed each other. But we found out that they had a meeting, and you'll find out what happened in that meeting. So, but that's just one phenomenon. And I mentioned the swimmers, those very unusual beings that the Soviets tried to capture in 1982. And we have a lot of other cases from 1982 through the book. Your readers will see, because not only in Siberia, but in other parts of Russia, including Ukraine at that time, and everywhere else. And just like 1965 cases, you had all over the globe, and the Soviets were able to see them. So we also try to bring attention of the people to the Pacific Bermuda Triangle and the very unusual areas like the Devil's Sea. It's about 100 kilometers south of Japan, and what the Soviets had observed there. And not only Soviets, but the Russian Navy well before the Soviet Union. And please understand that with all the commotion we have today, with China building their bases on the islands that are in conflict in the South China Sea and so forth, this is the area in the Pacific Ocean where USOs had been sighted quite a lot by Russian and Soviet navies, submarines mostly. It's like this area attracts them. And in my humble opinion, I believe that the Russian Navy and the Chinese Navy and the American Navy, I think they all understand what's going on. And if they build up their forces in that region, it's not only because they want to fight over a very, very wealthy islands, because there are a lot of resources down below, oil and so forth. But at the same time, I think our governments understand what's going on to the extent that they have to sooner or later face this danger and challenge, wherever it comes from, And what's interesting is that not long ago I saw information about the joint military games between Chinese and Russian navies, Chinese and American navies. So it's very interesting to me. And I got to tell you, I respect the commanders of such navies, because I think they know what's going on. Just like the Arctic Ocean, we have a big chapter in the book about the Arctic Ocean, and since I was a child in the Soviet Union, I've studied quite a lot about that area and the brave people who on the Soviet side and Russian side who tried to explore it and change it. At the same time, we present very interesting information about Soviet military attention to this area and numerous USOs there.
Wow.
I got to tell you, definitely from 1920s on, the Arctic Ocean had attracted the Soviet government. And we list, information. And it would go from the Kola Peninsula all the way through the Siberian lands and to Yakutia. Yakutia is especially a land of amazement. And I ask that if anybody ever travels to Russia, not just to go to St. Petersburg and Moscow, not that you will not see UFOs in that area, but definitely you will see a lot more interesting stuff in Yakutia, in Siberia, Chukotka, Kamchatka. There are some parts in the Arctic Ocean where they will not let you come. For example, the strategic city of Norilsk, very interesting city, and I think it's north of the North Pole area. But down below, a little bit south, in the Taimyr Peninsula, which is almost unexplored, you will see quite a lot if you can get there, because it's almost impossible for the locals to travel there. But this is the area, and we present it, of the where the Soviets found industrial diamonds, which are much more than regular diamonds and present excellent scientific possibilities for the future. But that's where the USOs and UFOs are cited. And we mentioned the most interesting village of Khatanga, that's in Yakutia, and reports from the local meteorological station. They have a special file on USOs and the amazing cases from 1979. But we went beyond. We found out some reports from the Setka program that I already mentioned about the unusual, gigantic object that had been cited in October of 1979, to the extent that letters were sent out to the research programs in existence in the Soviet Union. I have to mention one more, to the magazines, such as I told you about Technika Молодежи, and newspapers, because people saw gigantic UFO in the sky over their frozen land, and they had to report it. And although in most cases, they would be laughed at, in some cases it didn't happen. They would just hide the reports. But in that area of the Arctic, around Khatanga and and a few other places around, we mentioned all the cases. This is incredible what has been seen. And no matter what those professional scientists, debunkers tell you, we have reports, like I said, from the Soviet meteorological station. These people are not lying; they don't need to. But if you need more, in our chapter about the Arctic, we mention Vladimir Lukin, who is the head of the Vostok exploration. He's the head of the Arctic and Antarctic expeditions of the Russian Federation. In 1984, he was a scientist, and he himself had observed UFOs in that area. And in 1997, he went to the headquarters of the Anomalia newspaper. He sat down and he told Russian UFO researchers, such as Mikhail Gerstein, probably one of the best in Russia today, and a few others, about his experiences. Now, this is a top-notch scientist. Okay, this is not somebody, a bureaucratic debunker who wants to put a clap down on UFO research. This is people with world-renowned names, and we have more than that. I wanted to mention one more program. This is very important, and we list it in our books. When the SETCA program was collecting information, they did not get enough, we think. They wanted just from the military sources. I think they found out so much, they were amazed to such an extent that they needed to establish patterns and find out more. So this is very unusual and has no anything similar in the West or anywhere else. In 1984, again, the same year, 1984, very interesting. In the Soviet Union, they established a civilian government-sponsored organization, actually government organizations for the civilians to send their reports to. And one of the people who was in charge of it, very much involved with it, was Pavel Popovich, the Soviet cosmonaut born in Ukraine, which always pride to us, and very energetic in helping ufologists. We have a saying now in Russia, when you provide roof for somebody, it means that you provide protection. It's a modern Russian slang. Well, he provided so-called roof for UFO researchers who were not liked by the Communist Party. He was very instrumental in helping them, and he also spoke out a lot in defense of UFO research and pushed as much as possible to actually get it, research in an open way in the Soviet Union. Well, he got a lot of what he wanted to. He helped Vladimir Zhazha form the Soviet UFO Research Center, which was very important achievement at the time, and he was the one that later received the so-called KGB UFO documents, 124 pages of the blue file from the hands of the KGB General Nikolai Sham. Philip Mantle should tell you because he obtained very interesting information, and we published them too, about the Nikolai Sham revelations. Mm-hmm. So Popovich was a historical personality in the Soviet UFO research. And again, I've studied UFO research in the United States and in China, and I do not find any similarity anywhere else. Despite Soviet communist, what should I say, ideology prevalent all over, we had to study this bloody Marxism, Leninism every time they pushed it on us. We had to spend time studying this dead ideology. Despite all of this nonsense, Popovich was able to help UFO research. And he was placed somewhat in charge with another person, an academician, Troitsky, in charge of that other program. That's important because we have cases in this book and others, but especially USO book, cases of observations that were sent to this research program. So you had this powerful and super secret Soviet military academic program, SETCA. You had the other program, we mentioned all the details about it, in the Soviet Union, and you had UFO researchers who did their best to bring out information, and they did bring a lot. No matter that it was a totalitarian government, information was collected. It wasn't dispersed, disseminated. And that's why when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, all of it came out. A lot of it came out. And, I was there. I've had my contacts with people in the Soviet Union for years, and especially after 1991, I started getting information too. Very interesting.
Now, do they have any type of You said that a lot of information was released, which is great, but there's no such thing as like a Freedom of Information Act or anything like that. As far as you, a person or a ufologist trying to get documents from the government, is that next to impossible?
It's next to impossible, and I have to tell you, people have to be careful in the Soviet Union. A few people got sent to the mental asylums.
Wow.
Because they didn't like, and some people in the Baltics I know were actually threatened, and to the extent. Look at Ajaja. He couldn't find work until he was given opportunity to work and study UFOs and USOs by his friends from the Navy, because he himself was a submariner. And but it was very difficult. Some of the people were just shut down, like Fomin, who was a lecturer in 1950s, who presented lectures about UFOs. I mean, you couldn't just go and hire a hall and do it. He had to go through the auspices of the Soviet Knowledge Society and say, well, I want to talk about ancient mysteries, this and that, and he was able to speak, and a few others. But then came, then they found out. Somebody informed on him, some stool pigeon, whatever, and it was shut down. You couldn't just go out and publish articles about UFOs. Some were published, some very interesting, we did make it through the censorship and found, were published in media. For example, 1967, which, and I'll give you one example of what we have in the book. 1967, by the way, was a year of liberty for UFO research in the Soviet Union. Very interesting. For some reason, they allowed information to be published, and there was a case in the Baltic area in 1967 when, in November, there was a gigantic UFO. It appeared over the shore of the Baltic Sea near Liepaja. That's a city in Latvia. It was a semi-sphere of huge proportions. It was glimmering as it hovered low over the ground. So it couldn't be mistaken for a cloud, airplane, satellite, or any other conventional object. Its glow was fiery and painful to look at with unprotected eyes. It began to move later, and then it quickly vanished over the horizon. And among those people who witnessed it were scientists, meteorologists. And this was published in 1967 in a Soviet Latvian newspaper. And there were a few more. But you had to be careful. Because when in 1985, another incident was published, account of another incident was published in 1985 in a Soviet newspaper, Socialistiskaya Industria. Very, very, very sinister UFO observations. We're still not sure till the end what it was. Most likely it had to be Soviet naval missile testing and maybe more in the sky. But people died, and it wasn't a pretty... Anyway, it wasn't well done. But the editor who published it was fired, and a lot of other people were fired, and the newspaper was almost closed down, but it was not. So you had to be careful. But what I wanted to let you know is that, information did come out to the extent possible. But when the Soviet Union fell apart, this was so interesting, because then information started coming out. And I would say till 1994, a lot leaked out. Then situation changed in Russia. It wasn't as free as before. And there was no internet. Nevertheless, we still, were able to receive information, and I want to thank again our Russian colleagues who were not afraid to study UFOs under different regimes. But also, I want to point your attention, for example, to Soviet military people who came out with information. There were quite a lot, and in the early 2000s, there were a few programs on Russian TV, and I was amazed to see stories I published years before confirmed by former top Soviet Navy personnel. But back 25 years ago, I found a very interesting report by somebody who I wish I could find him, but I can't. Nikolai Dyomin, who was a Soviet Navy officer, very professional. And I published it. He stated that just like many other Soviet military officers, he didn't consider UFOs to be optical illusions. The UFOs his friends and colleagues observed were the same saucers, balls, and rays as seen through the ages in other parts of the world. But they recorded such observations with the precision and impartiality of military reports. And he mentioned that naval observers utilized special technical means to record such objects, and because they wanted to find out, their flight dynamics. And now, what's interesting, and at that time we didn't know about the existence of the secret Soviet UFO program. He said that the sightings were checked and verified by Soviet fleet meteorological officers, and they were positively shown to be objects that were not results of human technological activity or optical illusions. That's very important. Now, USOs. Again, we have reports that go back to antiquity, but we're mostly interested in the times where you could confirm it, and we have from many parts of the world. I already brought your attention to the Arctic region, to the Pacific Ocean around the area of Japan and China. A very dynamic area, but also I want to, very few people write about this part of the world in a calm manner, the Antarctic. I know stories, I've heard stories about Nazi bases and all that. Now, the Soviet military observers, submariners, and others definitely were lurking around the Antarctic area, especially the British island of South Georgia, very important place, and you will see in our book why and the stories they had seen. This is an area that is not very well known to civilians, but is of very much interest to scientists from Russia, India, China, the United States, of course, South America, and others. Something is going on there, and it's not just the Lake Vostok research and other lakes that were found not long ago, and I suggest people follow up on the stories coming from there. There is something in that area that, like a magnet, attracts our scientists and UFOs and USOs. And Philip, we just brought out the Soviet and Russian aspect of the research. We even have photographs that we were able to obtain of UFOs over the island. But if anybody ever goes to South Georgia Island, and there are ways to get there, and it's a wonderful place to visit, I think they should keep in mind that it's an area of high UFO, USO activity, and there is something definitely down at the bottom of the ocean in that area.
Wow.
What was amazing to me is that about the earthquakes that took place a few days ago. Not many people know that there was a larger earthquake in the ocean right next to South Georgia Island a few days ago. And if you hear about USO observations, it will not be a surprise to me, because during natural calamities, we've noticed that USOs and UFOs had been sighted over Russian territories.
Wow. Amazing. One of the things you touched on, I don't want to go off of the USO subject too far, but you mentioned that in your book you talk a little bit about the Chernobyl UFO, and I really would like to touch on that just for a minute, because that's fascinating to me. I had heard a rumor that the sarcophagus, or whatever it is, that was covered over, that there was something that interacted with Chernobyl, a UFO. Is that anything that you heard about?
It's not in this book. Yes, and we present it in our other books. It's interacted, it's impacted, and I think it made sure that it's at the right verb probably would be attenuated, or made it much less, the impact of the Chernobyl explosion, and we list names of the people who had actually observed it and, what happened. But I got to tell you that UFOs had been seen in that area, and we present very detailed information a few years after, because nothing is, resolved with the Chernobyl nuclear reactor.
Right.
Till then, we're not sure. I mean, there are issues there. Ukraine is a poor state, and given the help of the international community, it's being covered, protected. But to the extent that it's over, I'm not sure. That's why there were observations of UFOs after that too. And yes, in 1986, something definitely happened, and there was a UFO, fiery sphere that was, as I recall, observed in that area, and by people who actually work there, and young scientists and so forth. But that's not the only area. And in the book about USOs, for example, we list Altai and the observations in the Altai Mountains of Russia, and some other areas like the Ural Mountains, where there had been a number of ecological disasters caused by Soviet military experiments. Or look at the Sea of Aral. That's what the Soviets were trying to change nature, and they made sure. What happened at the end is that that sea is almost gone, and because of that, we actually found out very interesting things at the bottom of that sea. It's not Nazca lines, but it's very interesting images that you could see there, and we'll list them. But the point is that we heard rumors of a secret nuclear explosion in that area. They were testing something many years ago. But the UFOs definitely are attracted. And USOs. And this is something important. There is a lake, for example, in the Central Asia. And during the Soviet period, when it was part of the Soviet Union, and they had a Soviet tracking station to spy on U.S. SDI technology and satellites in early 1980s, they were observing UFOs coming in and out of that lake. Now, that lake per se presents a danger to the lands below, for Afghanistan and a few other countries. If the water ever breaks and rolls down, it could make a lot of problems. And consistently, UFOs were observed coming in and out from that area. And it was listed in the Soviet Military Engineering Bulletin. We will talk about it. So, you have that. If we something interesting, let's go now to North Russia and, areas around Scandinavia. Scandinavia is a prominent part let's say Russian land next to Scandinavia is a prominent part of our book too, because so much is happening there, very much. I published an article some years ago, and it was reprinted and posted on the Russian Navy site about the observations of the so-called Russian submarines in the area, Soviet submarines. I have no doubts that the Soviets would spy if they have, if there was a chance. But sometimes whatever was spying or whatever was actually in the area was blamed on the Soviets. And it wasn't always the case, because there is a high level of visitation, let's say, in the waters of Norway, Sweden, and so forth. But what's interesting is that if we don't just limit ourselves with the present, we have a report from the Dutch diplomat. It was basically an espionage report coming from St. Petersburg. Fascinating story. It's in our chapter about the Baltic Sea. Fascinating, because this is an official document in the Russian state archives about a battle in the sky over St. Petersburg. And this goes, back to the days of Peter the Great. Very detailed, very scary.
It's almost like the Nuremberg battle. It sounds like back in the 1500s.
Oh. Well, here it was. I think it was a little bit more than that, and there was an object that appeared outside of the clash of the two other objects. But it was confirmed by a famous Russian naval admiral, Naum Sinyavin, separately from the report of the Dutch diplomat. And again, this is very interesting. We also present another story which very few people know about the mysterious flame in the Baltic Sea and the correlating observation of a strange meteorite that was observed in the sky at that time in 1845, the same year where there were a lot of natural disasters right there that impacted Poland and Germany. So there is a lot of, and we also try to present information about more ancient stories, and not just stories, but I don't want to say facts, but at least accounts of lost space ships. There's a research that took place a while ago, some 20 years ago and so forth, in the area of northern Russia. But beyond that, we also try to present, smaller cases, and there are quite a lot. Going back, for example, 1947, we have very interesting information about, attack on the Soviet military regiment, and you name it. We have a lot. I think we have hundreds of cases that we separated into geographical and temporal sections.
Mm-hmm. A question for you. Go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. No, that's fine. Go ahead.
All right. The listeners will know because I was broadcasting from there, but I was in Russia for a month this year in Sochi and Novorossiysk and on the Black Sea. And so I did a little bit of research while I was there, just seeing what type of activity was there. I didn't see anything about USOs, but there were a lot of UFO sightings in the area. But are you familiar with any? I haven't heard you mention the Black Sea yet. Are there any?
We haven't gotten there yet. Yeah,
okay.
We have a chapter.
Oh, okay.
We have a whole chapter. Yeah, we have a whole chapter 13, and it's a big chapter, and there were very interesting cases. Some I have went back to 1950s. And one of them was, it's an interesting case, and I mentioned it for years in my writings. It took place, I believe, in the early 1950s. I had a colleague and a friend who passed away a few years ago, Ukrainian writer Valentin Krapiva, and he was very instrumental in early 1990s in bringing out information that was covered up in the Soviet Union. He had good connections, and I got to give it to him. Well, he knew Professor Korsakov of the Odessa University. He met with him, and the professor told him about his friend, who was a Soviet Navy officer and served at the Sevastopol Naval Base in Crimea. So he personally, that officer, observed a UFO, and that UFO, I mean, you can call it UFO or USO. The object, just ascended from under the sea behind a battle cruiser. Okay, and the officer was under impression that it came, from the depths of the Black Sea. Now, the professor had a photograph, and Krapiva was trying to get it, but he was not able to. Now, remember, I told you in the beginning of our conversation about Alexander Kuzovkin, who was a very diligent researcher of UFO phenomena in the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. He didn't die. He committed suicide at the end of his life because he came to the conclusion that we cannot. So he knew too much. It's almost like that in Indiana Jones, the last movie when the Soviet officer, the woman, when she went crazy, fell to pieces when she got knowledge from the aliens. Well, it's something like that happened. I don't want to make it into a comedy, but he definitely knew too much, and he burned a lot of his materials. We'll never regain them. Wow. But when he was able to publish some things, and a lot of them were in the Samizdat, which was underground publishing in the Soviet Union, and people paid price for publishing unauthorized materials. But UFO researchers did too. They were not dissidents, but they risked their livelihood. Anyway, I told you about the report he had. He met with the scientists, marine scientists, who had studied the Black Sea and went down and saw this gigantic wheel, 10-story building, in size. Wow. Wheel that stood vertically and spinned around basically, and then it became horizontal and disappeared. But in our book you will see interesting similar incidents. Now, it's good that you brought 1965, and I hope Alejandro is listening, because I have a very interesting case in the book we found out in August of 1965, and I underline August 1965, because those who read this book will find out other cases from August of 1965, far away from the Black Sea. But at that time, in the Black Sea, Soviet astronomer, her last name was Tsekhanovich, she was a lecturer from the Moscow Observatory, and she was on vacation. And it was, at the top Soviet resort, Novy Afon. It's an area, northwest of Caucasus. Now, it was. I have a very good description. She was swimming in the sea. The air was clear, cloudless, and warm. Now, about 20 minutes after the sunset, she headed to the shore, about 100 meters away. Suddenly, high in the sky to the west, she noticed a black spot, and soon she made out it was like an elongated body, a long body. At first, she thought this was an airplane, but she saw no wings and heard no engine noise. Remember this description. I'll tell you why later. The object flew over the sea west to east. At about 400 meters distance from her, it descended to about 100 meters over the sea. Then it turned at a 90-degree angle as if it was on its axis. When it turned, a band of light flashed in its center, and she noticed that the object was disc-shaped. As it turned, the light intensified. In a few seconds, the shape changed into a circle. Its center had something like a porthole, about the half size of the object itself, and it was glowing with yellow light. The object then flew north towards the shore, gaining speed and altitude as it did, until it became a dot in the distance and disappeared. Okay? It lasted about all over probably a minute. Now, this information is from Felix Ziegel's writings, and Felix Ziegel was the famous Soviet astronomer and a researcher who was not afraid to study UFOs and always suffered for that from the Soviet government. And he never made it to see the shackles of ideology, of censorship, taken away from the subject of UFOs. He died in 1988. In 1989, it became possible to say the word UFO in Soviet media openly. And we have to thank Gorbachev for that.
Wow.
But the description I gave you is very interesting, because we have other, throughout our books, and of course in the USO book, you have other interesting objects similar to what this astronomer had described from 1967. And it's interesting because, as you go through the book, you will see that descriptions of large cylinders that separate into small parts and rejoin later, and the observations come from the Soviet naval intelligence personnel, so, that's important. And you see, other objects like that. So, again, the quality of the information and the observers presented in the book we're very proud of, because, it took us a number of years to get it together.
I bet.
And we present it.
Yeah, I bet. One of the things I heard you mention is submariners, or submariners, however you say that. We actually had someone on the show, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago, that was that observed a USO on radar, clocked at something like 90 nautical miles an hour, just going super fast. And it was the skipper aboard the sub acted like it was hush hush, like this almost happens a lot. I thought that was really interesting. So can you talk about a couple of the cases that involve submarines?
Sure. We have one chapter called Russian Submarines and USOs, but of course we have throughout the book observations of Russian submarines. Well, we talked about 1965, so let's stick with this year. There was a case in 1965 when it was a Soviet submarine was definitely on a spy mission in the Atlantic Ocean. In the Atlantic Ocean, you will see the cases we have there. The most numerous cases took place in the Atlantic Ocean. So it came to the meeting a little bit early. Okay, so the crew had a chance to surface, to go on the deck. Everything was quiet. There was a cloudless sky, no enemy around, and then all of a sudden they see a cigar-shaped object moving noiselessly through the sky, making no noise. Okay, this was in the international waters, but if the adversary was there, nobody would pay attention. So they wanted to dive immediately, but what they found out is the onboard radar did not record anything, like nothing was around it.
Wow.
So the captain, he didn't know. Yeah, he said, okay, let's remain on the surface. All of a sudden, there were 3 beams of light that shot out from the UFO, and the Soviets were able to see that object quite closely. It looked like an airship, but it had no gondolas, no rudders, and nothing horizontal or vertical attached to it. It was large. They recorded it was about 250 meters long, and the Soviet Navy people knew that the U.S. had no such dirigibles, not at all. So then slowly that object descended right into the ocean, and the searchlight was still on. It submerged under the water, and what happened is that time the sonar from the submarine registered a strange and very intensive hissing sound, and it faded away. And by the way, when it comes to noises, our chapter 2, when we talk about the quackery phenomenon, you will see a lot about noises. We present information and opinions from the former Soviet submarine officers. It's amazing.
Wow.
So this was one of the cases. Let's see. I told you about the case of Kuzovkin, but let's say 1951. I always like the 1950s because, for a few reasons, when it comes to the Soviet UFO research. We present a lot in this book and in other books, a lot of information in other books, plus Stalin was in power. And when you read about the Arctic regions, you will find out, we were able to find out that there was a very intensive and gigantic program, secret program to explore the Arctic, but under Stalin, everything was put in and then it was shut down. But in a way that it was preserved for the future. And there was another program too, but we're talking about Stalin. Here's an interesting case from 1951. There was a Soviet submarine that encountered a strange underwater object. It was of very large size. It ignored all requests for identification and just continued on a steady course towards the shore of the USSR. So the captain of the submarine ordered depth charges to be dropped, bombs at the USO location. No reaction to the attack. The USO just continued without any change in speed. And then after some time, it just unexpectedly and abruptly ascended towards the surface. And then at the, when it was about 50 meters deep in the water, it stopped, changed course, and departed. This was 1978. Wow. We can tell you, other stories from 1978, 1979, and so forth. Like I said, we have stories from the Bermuda Triangle because the Soviets were there too, and they had very interesting sightings in the deep waters of Bahamas, Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and east coast of the United States. Okay, because they were interested, and what sometimes scared them is on their way to the Atlantic Ocean, and right there they were encountered by this strange phenomena we mentioned in the second chapter, and they assumed that they were spied on by the Americans, but it was a very wrong assumption. So those are the cases, and again, we have a lot of them, and we mentioned submarines and lectures given by submarine officers where they speak about Soviet Navy submarines chased by other objects, where the pursuers could change their speed at will and were faster than any other vessels known to be at the time. Wow. This is a challenge, and it's a challenge that sooner or later we will face. And like I said, I think those in charge of the naval forces understand what's going on. I remember that many years ago, I found out that my first book, the Soviet UFO files, was part of the U.S. Navy library, which is okay, Oh,
wow.
I'm glad. I'm not sure if it still is. I don't think that site is even accessible, but that's why we write the book. So, here and in other countries, people realize what's going on. There is nothing that we obtained illegally from the Soviet Union, and rest assured that the deepest secrets the Soviet Union has, Soviet Navy, will never be, and Russian Navy will never be made public unless something drastic happens. And we list it because some years ago there were people that claimed that the Soviet Union is going to declassify their files, Navy files. And of course they came out and they said, this is not going to happen. And we understand it. U.S. will not do the same, because if you declassify, you'll find out where their submarines are, going on their missions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
I can understand
Russia has,
that part of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Russia is, historically, it tends to be a closed society, and we're not going to discuss politics, but, every nation has its quirk, so to say. Every nation has its, and Russia is no different. But no matter when I speak or where I speak, I also ask listeners to pay attention to China, because China is becoming a world power, and its UFO research is unlike ours or in Russia. Unlike, because that's where the government pays close attention to UFO research and actually sponsors a number of organizations. And I think, thousands, tens of thousands of scientists are involved. And I've had some articles, and people can see it on my website.
Yeah, that is interesting. Now, this SEPTGAU, or however you say it, organization, did you say? Yeah, did you say that was in part coordinated by the government, or was that all civilian?
No, it was fully coordinated. Because if anything was not coordinated by the government, then the way was to either wind up in the concentration camp or in the mental asylum. Anything unsanctioned, you couldn't do it. Now, this was a totally government-led, instigated research, and government people worked for it, because you had scientists on one hand, and we presented in full detail, names and dates, and military officers involved. We also list names of the Russian, Soviet Navy intelligence commanders and others who were instrumental in this program and what they revealed. Mm-hmm. This was a program that was put in motion in 1978 for sure, but some parts started well before. Navy parts started in '76, and there was a reason for it, and you will see. People who read the book will understand when they read about the what's the right word, a very unusual dance of the UFOs over a Soviet submarine station, and how it scared the Soviet government. But anyway, this was a program that lasted from '78 for sure through 1991, and it was very active. It used scientists such as meteorologists, and of course, I believe they had about, I don't remember the number exactly, but about 30 Soviet higher institutes involved in that, and we list them. We list them because it's very important. And some of those scientists, I gotta tell you, they were so persistent. Not the people at the top. No, those are the debunkers who didn't want to do anything. But some of the scientists are very persistent. I have an article, by the way, also in Open Minds about the Kazakhstan research by such scientists. Very interesting, very unusual cases. But in the USO book, we also have at least two. One is the mention of 1982 of that strange being that was sighted, and this was one case, and this was one case, and the other was in also 1982, but had to do with the Russian case that goes back to the 17th century, and it's in our book. It's a famous case, one of the best from the Middle Ages and in later times, of a UFO observation over the lake. And the description was given by a very able person who was able to write everything down and present the details. This was a very sinister case, I should say, when an object kept coming back to the lake and scaring local people who just came out from the church. The Robozero, Robozero. There's a chapter about it in the book. And in 1982, an expedition which included the Soviet scientists from this Setka program went back to that area to study the impact of that body from the 17th century on the soil of the area. It was very interesting because they found scientific confirmation that something took place, residual matter and so forth. So you ask about Setka, there are two examples. There are more. I remember there are more because there was a case from, I believe, the Indian Ocean, which was reported through the Setka program and somehow surfaced too.
Now, is there any such organization or similar organization that you're aware of now that collects UFO data?
Well, I have no doubts that it goes on, but it would be completely different today. There are other ways to collect matter. I think that the Russian government is very much interested. They have to be, because the Russian Navy is becoming very powerful. They are building small and very powerful submarines. Unusual design. I know Putin himself, for example, went to the bottom of the Lake Baikal in 2009, and I wanted to humor myself, thinking maybe he read my book on Philip's writings too. But I think he knows himself what he needs to know, and I would be surprised if Russia would not have an organization that studies USOs and UFOs to the extent possible. And remember, today we can grasp and see much more than 30, 40, 50 years ago, simply because of the development of our technology. We have underwater robots, and we can explore Mariana Trench much more than before. And those who read our book will understand why when they read about the Mariana Trench and a few other places like that. And definitely we will see much more. But there is more than that. I mean, when you read all these observations and reports and you put things together, you start seeing patterns, and it's very interesting. And you start thinking, well, are there tunnels that we don't know about that exist under the surface of the Earth core, maybe, or down below that connect the oceans, or Lake Baikal with the ocean? Could be. And then we start trying to find confirmation. And I got to tell you, I'm proud of what we did for the chapter of the swimmers. People often, some researchers talk about ancient India and Vimana weapons and so forth. We found a different angle. We found descriptions in the Mahabharata of the ancient battles between demigods and celestial beings and the underwater demons. And we give description of the underwater demon race that existed, complete detail, description of the battles. It's like reading science fiction novel today, because we don't even have weapons like that. We still don't have illusion weapons to the extent that I know, and a few others. But most important, we tie ancient Indian myths or stories to the lakes and the areas we describe. Tibet, because you will see a few things that we found out about Tibet, Baikal, and others. And this is fascinating, because I think this should be continued, because ancient India had stories of beings that Soviet military, Soviet naval commanders observed in the sea maybe 30 years ago. That's what's fascinating.
Wow.
And there are ancient Chinese observations of so-called USOs and so forth, and Japan has a number of stories, but Japan is right there, and right next to Russia, so a lot of the cases we describe are from that area too. Very interesting cases. And you can see that in the antiquity, people had observed very unusual things, and that's how we start the book. That's how it starts. With a Russian writer. He died in London some years ago. He was very famous because if Eric von Däniken started writing here in the 1960s, in Russia we had people before, scientists, who were interested in the ancient contacts, ancient visitation, paleo contact as it was called, and were able to publish some of the hypotheses they had. I still have books from early 1970s. They were very fearless, very determined researchers. Now, this guy had information about an object, a USO, that goes back probably a few thousand years ago in the Mediterranean. And you will see more. Those who read our books will definitely want to find out about Central Asia and some of the lakes in that part of the world, and ancient observations of UFOs and USOs, and also very interesting modern cases.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about modern. The antiquity is really fascinating to me, but I just wondered, in your book, what is the latest case that you report on?
2006, Ukraine, Black Sea.
You want to just
very cool case.
Yeah, let's hear that case if that's all right.
Well, it was a very interesting observation by a crew of the joint Russian-Ukrainian naval mission to study they wanted to find the site where Armenia, it was the name of the Soviet ship that Nazi Germany sunk. It was a medical ship, and it went down with many people aboard. And when they were in the area of the alleged presence of that ship, they cited something very unusual, and we present that information in 2006. And So, but we have cases that go back to 2000. I think there was one from 2002. Observations from Russian scientists mostly, which is very interesting, like Avramenko and others. It's in the book. So and of course, if anything else comes, anything later comes by that's revealed, we'll publish it. But I just don't think that a lot of information will be able, unless recorded by people who have cameras today and so forth. But again, like I said, a lot of the reports, for example, would come from Arctic, hard-to-reach areas or Yakutia. You have to get there to be able to photograph something.
Right.
Russia is very much unexplored land. In Siberia, in the taiga forest, my father served in the Soviet Army in the 1950s, and he was in the communications unit. They would put communication lines, and he went from Magadan, from the very removed, far remote areas in the Far East, Siberia, and so forth. It was a very unsteady period when the concentration camps were closed down and a lot of people were let out, political prisoners, but also criminals. He had observed cannibals. He had seen a lot while he served in those areas. And he told me, for thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles, there's nobody who lives there. And if anybody does, you don't know about them. And they don't know about the outside world. There were villages that were discovered in the Soviet Union, like 1960s, 1970s, of people who lived without any contact with the population for hundreds of years.
Yes, I've heard about that. And they invent their own languages and everything.
Their own languages. The old believers, Starovery, those who escaped Peter the Great and all other Russian czars and dictators and so forth. And, those who escaped the Soviet Union, the Soviet government, you can find them too. And it's like the 1908 case, which we describe in other books, but it's very interesting. The Tunguska case.
Right.
It's hard to get there, but we did get a lot of information. We also in the chapter about Far East, we present observations of the hunters, local hunters. We always want to present views of those people who were largely decimated during the Soviet time and even before. We want them to be heard too, because their cultures and their beliefs vanished to an extent. They become Russified, whether they wanted to or not. Their faith was taken away. They became Russian Orthodox forcefully, but many of them resisted, and we have stories about that too, very interesting stories. But their observations deserve to be heard, and it's very interesting. I did in the Yakutia chapter, and I also did an episode for Ancient Aliens once about Yakutia. There's much more. I wish Americans and others had a chance to travel and see more of it, or we got more information to write. There are very unusual objects in that land.
Wow. The countryside of Russia, like you said, there's so much unexplored area, and that kind of leads me. I heard you say the Ural Mountains earlier, and had you ever looked into the Dyatlov Pass incident? I mean, that's always been just fascinating.
Yes. Absolutely. And we presented in our earlier books, not in this one, it has nothing to do with it, but it's a fascinating and complicated case because nobody knows till the end what killed them.
Right.
But we have our own idea. We have our own presentation, but it has nothing to do with UFOs, USOs, and I've studied it before, and something that we will publish more about later. But this case is by no means ended. But I got to tell you that in our USO book, we have very interesting information about various physical impacts on human psyche. Because not everything we see, I would say, I have to agree with Evgeny Litvinov. He's in our book, one of the active former Soviet naval military people who collect information about USOs. He says that about 70% should be explained and can be explained as military tests, and other phenomena, natural phenomena. But definitely 30% cannot be explained. And I would say of the 30%, 10% defy any explanation we can have in our world.
Mm-hmm.
And people sometimes see things that they mistake for UFOs and USOs, and that's why the governments don't like people to look up too much in the sky or underwater, and then they have hired people who can explain it away, debunk it. But we still don't know all the physical world around us. And in our chapter about the Arctic Ocean, you will see a description that came out in the 1950s in the Soviet Union, based on that Stalin's secret program to study the Arctic. Most of the information is unavailable, but what came out and what the Soviet airmen had observed on the ice flows in the Arctic is fascinating. And sometimes in many ways it brings me back to the Edgar Allan Poe description of the Antarctic, very strange book that he had about the Antarctic ocean and the Antarctic land and the air, happenings around. We know very little about the South Pole, the North Pole, what's going on there.
Yes.
But there are those who have to. And, your hair will stand up when you read the story that they presented.
Yeah. It's I think we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the oceans, and it is very intriguing. This subject of USOs has been very intriguing to me because what a great place to hide if something can. There's so many cases, and I'm sure you know a lot of them, and probably a lot in your book, where the thing just flies in the sky and then right into the water, almost like at the same speed. Just fascinating.
Or through the ice. Yeah.
Yeah, through the ice.
Or breaking the ice. Yeah. We have a lot of cases, which is very interesting. And then, the objects that change shape or move around and speeds we cannot even fathom. And we cannot explain it. And, there were interesting cases of interaction. And you will see, I don't want to spoil the mood, but people will see what's going on. Sometimes Soviets lost their aircraft or other craft, when encountering UFOs and USOs. And again, they were scared. They were definitely scared. And to me, it seems like somebody would push away, a playful child who gets too curious, too noisy. They're being pushed away. And as not to bother the adults. Well, if whoever visits these planets are the adults, it's very unusual because we have stories of hostility, but we also have stories of attention to ecological damage done to the planet and prevalence of UFO reports from the Cold War, from the hottest moment of the Cold War. It's like the UFOs and USOs were always present. And in our other books, we describe Soviet space program and cosmonaut observations too. And what's very interesting, and it applies to this book too, is there was a Soviet academician, one of the top scientists, who said that during the Soviet space program, they felt like, they were under a microscope because UFOs would be present always, or almost always, at the launches of Soviet spacecraft and so forth. And Russia and the lands around, presented very interesting magnet to them. And Ukraine, my native land as well, definitely, because not only the Black Sea, but other areas in Ukraine too. But again, no matter how much interesting European cases are, especially from the Baltic Sea or the North Sea or the Norwegian waters, most interesting cases, I would say, take place in the Arctic areas, in Kamchatka, Chukotka, your readers will be able to read a case from Kamchatka from 1970, a sinister case of a UFO coming, out from the waters of a lake in that area. That's very interesting. And what happens to those who observed it? We have numerous stories of various lakes, big ones like Baikal, but also lakes in the northern Russia and other areas of the country. And USOs are observed in such lakes, deep water lakes, but, not only.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if there were only deep water lakes. So there are some lakes that are not, or that are more shallow that there's observed as well.
Yeah, and the attention when I'm proud of the information we were able to collect, and some of it came years ago, when I just started, getting a lot of it and being open to protect my sources in the Soviet Union. I had to be quiet for a few years, but I did publish in Russian mostly articles about UFO research in Australia, in the United States, and we published them here, and we smuggled into the Soviet Union, and people were able to read about UFO research here in the United States when everything else was shut down, and you couldn't. And of course, there were other publications translated, but not a lot. But after I would say 1991, it was like a flood of information came out. And remember, there were no tabloids at that time in Russia. Okay, now they learned. At that time in the Soviet Union, they didn't know. People were eager to share information, to present stuff that they knew about. So I received information very interesting about observations of one of the lakes around St. Petersburg, Leningrad at the time, and I want to turn your readers' attention to the Lake Ladoga, and very interesting cases, and a few others, Onega, and there's more than that. I know very serious researchers who had published a number of books in Russia, who are diligent and dedicate their life to UFO research, and they believe that there is an underwater base in Lake Ladoga, and they present their facts very interesting, and I have to agree with them because there is definitely something down below, and that area is heavily militarized around St. Petersburg and the Leningrad region. It has to be because they're right next to NATO and Scandinavia, and outside of any political, what should I say? I don't want to say fighting, but any political disagreements there may be, for sure. The Russian Army and Navy today understand and know about observations of USOs and other strange phenomena in their part of the world, and even the KGB, and we describe it, by the way. It was very. That's why I want to say it. And they knew about the Kola Peninsula phenomena, very unusual lakes, and your readers will understand, and other information. They knew about it back in 1920s, because there was in that time there was a research conducted by the KGB of the time. It was called differently, and they collected a lot of interesting information and sent out expeditions, especially to the Kola Peninsula. And in the 1938, it came to the end because the head of this research, KGB general, a very, very interesting person, he was purged, and people around him were executed, including the top Russian scientist Borchenko, who was involved in it. And the files had disappeared and gone. Probably not completely. I'm sure the Soviet or Russian government has those files, but people try to find them later. And this was a very unusual research, and they had a lot of active people, but again, most of them perished, and we don't know what happened. But what we do know is that the Kola Peninsula was of great interest to the Soviet Union in the early days of the Soviet government, and their friends in Nazi Germany were as much interested as the Soviets were, because they were good friends until a certain time in the 1930s. And Nazi Germany tried to wrestle Kola Peninsula away from the Soviet government when the World War II started. But the Soviets were able to protect it. However, there were Nazi espionage missions to the area, and they found some artifacts and so forth. So those who read our book will understand why. And again, this is the area of the concentration of the Russian naval power and submarine bases. Same area where USOs and UFOs visited late 1970s, 1980s. And we present a lot of cases in our book.
Yeah, have a question up here for you. Do you? And then we're almost running out of time pretty soon here. They want to know if you know of any cases around the Carpathian Mountains near the current Ukraine and southern Poland border.
Actually, yes, there were a number of cases we present in other books. One of them was in comes from the Setka program, fiery spheres flying and encountering Soviet aircraft. I think it was from 1984. Yes, there were cases. Actually, I keep up with the developments in the Ukrainian ufology, and just 2 days ago I read about a large number of UFO sightings in the Carpathian Mountains area, as contrasted to the rest of the Ukraine, which is very unusual. But at the same time, you need to remember, the Soviets, when they spied on U.S. satellites, they had a secret underground installations that local people did not know about. I know because I'm married to one of the local people. They knew nothing about. Nobody knew anything about that. But after the Soviet Union fell apart, they found out that this was the area of the U.S. of the station that spied the U.S. satellites. So yeah, there are a lot of cases in that part of the world.
I see. Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of hotspots too with what you've discussed before. Now, has there ever been any discussion or any reports that you're aware of any, I'm switching it over to UFO, any UFO crashes?
There are a lot of information about UFO crashes, but, most of them are definitely nonsense, because for an object that moves at such speed and so forth to be shot down by our meager capabilities, it's not unusual. But I don't want to impose my opinion on reported cases. And in our books, we present information, some very interesting, some from the Ukrainian scientist, a military scientist very active in the Soviet armed forces, who claims that yes, missiles did bring down one or two so-called UFOs, and the technology obtained from the UFO was used for Soviets to improve their missile capabilities. Also, the Dalnygorsk case of 1986, again, very fascinating year, 1986. There are pro and contra opinions of what it was. Was it a UFO or a high-level military satellite using most advanced technology available? We still don't know, but a lot of people do want to know.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so just one last question, because we are getting near the end here, and that is, can you go into, right at the very beginning of the show, you mentioned these humanoid-type things swimming without any, equipment or anything like that. Can you go into a little more detail of what they were reporting about that? And was that freshwater or was that saltwater?
Lake Baikal. You know what? It's a very complicated case. And Lake Baikal, by the way, had other incidents, including the strange and sinister, fiery glow that almost destroyed the Soviet contingents, and so forth. I prefer that people read about it. It's a very complicated case, and we present it in full with the information available to us, including, like I said, confirmation from a Russian writer who knew quite a lot about the territory and so forth, and the Setka program scientists who had observed some similar being later, and same year, and information from the Russian naval counterintelligence that had to investigate a similar case, not there, but a similar being in 1990. So it's a very interesting case, and I think people will like it when they read it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I didn't know I'd be able to ask this question, but we have just a minute here. Did besides what you heard about this crashed UFO and supposedly reverse technology for weapons or whatever it was there talk of more of that? You always hear about the Area 51, things like that, like there's reverse technology. Has there been talk over the years? I know you said there was a lot of nonsense. Is that all part of the nonsense?
Well, there was a lot of nonsense, a lot of the fabricated stories too. And there were stories that cannot be explained. In our books, if people are interested, they should read about the Monchegorsk case of 1987 that I think also involved attention from Mr. Gorbachev. 1987, there was a recovered object, and it's right there in the books that we write with Philip, not the USO book. And when people read those books, they'll be able to see all the information available, including dates and territories.
All right. Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
And
thank you for calling.
One more time, if you would, just say your website.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Paul Stonehill, Russian UFO and USO Research.com.
Wow, it's a long one. All right. Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So that's it for the show this evening. Thanks so much for listening. And next week we have Sam Maranto will be on from Illinois. And it's been an interesting evening, I thought, and I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks so much for supporting the show or listening live. And we'll be back next week. Remember to keep your eyes to the sky.